The discovery was made on a Tuesday, October 16, 1855. A circuit merchant named Silas Kane, his wagon heavy with bolts of cloth and barrels of salted fish, crested the final ridge overlooking Havenwood Creek, Virginia. He expected to see the familiar plume of wood smoke rising from the valley floor, to hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer or the laughter of children. Instead, an unnatural silence greeted him. It was a profound and unnerving quiet, the kind that settles in the wake of a catastrophe. The entire town, nestled in the amber and gold of the Appalachian autumn, was utterly still. Not a soul moved along its single dirt road. Not a curtain stirred in a window. As his horse nervously picked its way down the slope, Kane felt a cold dread begin to seep into his bones. It was a feeling he would later describe to authorities as the valley itself holding its breath, waiting for a scream that would never come. Doors to the cabins and the general store hung slightly ajar, swinging with a faint, rhythmic creak in the breeze. A half-eaten meal sat on a porch table swarmed by flies. A child's doll lay face down in the dirt, its porcelain eyes staring into nothing. It was as if every man, woman, and child had simply vanished. They had not fled. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of fire or plague or attack. They were just gone. The only sound, aside from the wind and the creaking doors, was the tolling of the church bell. A slow, intermittent, and mournful clang that echoed through the empty streets, pulled by a rope no one was holding. It was a chilling, macabre welcome to a town that had become a tomb, a ghost ship run aground in the Virginia mountains. And in the center of the town square, scrawled in what looked like ash on the community notice board, were three words: "The widow collects." Before the silence, before the horrifying mystery that would transform its name into a whispered, forbidden legend, Havenwood Creek was a picture of modest prosperity. Founded in 1842, it was a pocket of civilization carved from the dense, ancient wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Its lifeblood was timber, its spine was faith, and its heart was a community of roughly 150 souls, bound together by hardship and shared hope. The town was isolated, a full day's ride from the nearest significant settlement, and this isolation bred a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. Their world was one of hard work, governed by the rising and setting of the sun, and the stern, unwavering sermons of Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood. Blackwood was a man carved from mountain granite, with eyes that saw sin in every shadow and a voice that could make the devil himself tremble. He preached of diligence, piety, and the ever-present threat of temptation lurking just beyond the firelight, in the dark, whispering woods that surrounded them on all sides. The townsfolk were God-fearing people, their beliefs a mixture of staunch Presbyterianism and older, darker superstitions carried over from the old country. They believed in the power of prayer, but they also believed in hexes, omens, and things that walked in the night. They nailed horseshoes over their doors to ward off evil and whispered tales of haints and spectral beasts that dwelled in the deepest hollows. This duality, of devout faith and primal fear, was the fragile foundation upon which Havenwood Creek was built. They were a people who trusted in God, but who also knew, in the deepest parts of their souls, that there were some forms of darkness that Scripture alone could not explain or repel. They were about to encounter such a darkness, one that would not be exorcised by prayer, but would instead feed on it, growing stronger with every frightened whisper and every paranoid glance. A darkness that would arrive on a late summer evening in the form of a lone woman shrouded in black. Her name was Elara Vance. She arrived in late August of 1855, walking up the main road as the sun bled across the western ridges. She pulled a small, rickety cart containing a single, iron-bound chest. She was a widow, that much was clear from her stark black mourning dress, a garment that seemed to absorb the light around her. She was a striking figure, but not in a way that brought comfort. Her face was pale and etched with a sorrow so profound, it seemed to have settled permanently in the hollows of her cheeks and the deep, shadowed pools of her eyes. She spoke little, answering the town's cautious inquiries with quiet, clipped responses. Her husband had passed. She was seeking a quiet place to live out her days. She had purchased the old Miller cabin at the edge of town, a place that had stood empty for years, shunned by the locals for the bad luck that seemed to cling to its decaying timbers. The town matriarch, Martha Croft, wife of the town's founder, offered her condolences and a basket of bread and salted pork. Ilara accepted it with a nod, but her eyes remained distant, fixed on some unseen horizon that only she could perceive. From the very beginning, she was an object of intense and unnerving curiosity. She kept to herself, her only ventures into town being for essential supplies. She attended church that first Sunday, sitting alone in the rearmost pew, a silent, raven-like figure amidst the homespun cotton and wool. Reverend Blackwood's sermon on the sins of vanity and temptation seemed to be directed squarely at her, his booming voice causing others to shift uncomfortably and cast furtive glances her way. But Ilara remained unmoved, her gaze as steady and unreadable as a deep, still pool of water. Her presence was a stone dropped into the quiet pond of Havenwood Creek, and the ripples of unease began to spread almost immediately. The strangeness began with the animals. A few weeks after the widow's arrival, farmers started reporting a peculiar sickness among their livestock. It wasn't a disease they recognized. A milk cow would simply stop giving milk, then refuse to eat, standing listlessly in the field until it laid down and died within a day. A flock of chickens would be found dead in their coop, with no signs of predator or illness, just cold, stiff bodies in the morning straw. Jedediah Croft, the town's founder and a man of practical reason, lost two of his strongest draft horses in a single night. The veterinarian from the next county over was summoned, a gruff, experienced man named Dr. Abram. He examined the carcasses, his brow furrowed in confusion. He found no lesions, no fever, no inflammation. He declared it a wasting sickness of some unknown and unnatural origin. He had never seen anything like it. As the first frosts of autumn began to silver the rooftops at dawn, the ailment spread to the wild game. Hunters returned from the woods with disturbing stories. Deer, normally fat and healthy in preparation for winter, were found emaciated and dying, their coats dull and their eyes glazed over with a strange vacancy. The forest, once a reliable larder for the town, grew silent and barren. The squirrels vanished. The birdsong faded. A creeping, unnatural blight was settling over the valley, and with it, a growing sense of dread. The townsfolk gathered in hushed groups after Sunday service, their faces grim. They spoke of the failed harvest, of the strange stillness in the woods, and inevitably their conversations in lowered, fearful whispers would turn to the widow, Ilara Vance, the woman who lived at the edge of the woods where the blight seemed to be at its worst. It was just talk at first, a way to give a name to their fear. But the whispers were a seed of poison, planted in the fertile soil of their superstition, and it was beginning to take root. Then came the nightmares. It started with the children, as such horrifying things often do. Prudence Miller, the blacksmith's 7-year-old daughter, woke screaming in the middle of the night, claiming a tall, slender woman in a black dress had been standing at the foot of her bed. The woman didn't speak. Prudence sobbed to her parents, but she hummed a tune that made her bones feel cold. The Millers dismissed it as a simple night terror, a product of an overactive imagination. But 2 nights later, young Thomas Gable, who lived on the opposite side of town, woke his family with identical terrified screams. He described the same woman, the same black dress, and the same chilling, bone-deep hum. Within a fortnight, nearly a dozen children in Havenwood Creek were plagued by the same recurring nightmare. The details were always disturbingly consistent. The woman in black, her face obscured by shadow, standing silently in their rooms. Some children added a new detail, that she held out a pale hand, beckoning them toward the window, toward the dark woods beyond. The adults tried to rationalize it. They blamed a bad batch of flour from the mill or the eerie stories swapped by children at play. But the explanation felt hollow, a weak dam against a rising tide of collective fear. The children became withdrawn and fearful, refusing to sleep alone, their eyes wide with terror at the setting of the sun. They would draw her, unsettling crayon and charcoal figures of a tall, stick-like woman with no face, always dressed in black. Panic began to curdle the atmosphere of the town. The women whispered about it over their sewing circles. The men discussed it grimly at the general store. The figure in the nightmares bore an uncanny resemblance to the town's reclusive widow, the one who lived alone, who never smiled, who walked the edges of the woods as dusk fell. The one who had arrived just before everything started to go wrong. The macabre notion began to take hold. This was no mere coincidence. This was a curse. Reverend Blackwood saw the growing panic as a spiritual crisis. He called a special prayer meeting on a cold Wednesday evening, the church packed to the rafters with worried faces illuminated by the ring candlelight. His sermon that night was not one of comfort, but of fire and brimstone. He spoke of the insidious nature of evil, how it could slip into a community disguised as an ordinary traveler, a lost soul, a lonely widow. He never mentioned Alara Vance by name, but he didn't have to. Every single person in that church knew who he was talking about. His voice boomed through the nave, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of a spiritual blight that had descended upon their town. "The devil walks among us," he thundered, his fist striking the pulpit. "He does not come with horns and a pitchfork, but with a quiet demeanor and a sorrowful tale. He finds the cracks in our faith and plants his seeds of despair. The sickness in our livestock, the silence in our woods, the terror in the dreams of our children, these are not acts of nature. They are the work of a malevolent will, a harbinger of darkness in our very midst." The congregation was rapt, their fear being shaped and focused by the preacher's powerful words. He was giving their terror a face. He was telling them who to blame. After the sermon, the townsfolk didn't disperse as they usually did. They gathered on the church steps, the chill in the air forgotten, replaced by a feverish energy. The whispers were louder now, more certain. "He's right," one farmer muttered. "The trouble started when she arrived." "My Sarah won't sleep," a woman added, her voice trembling. "She says the Black Widow is coming for her." The term stuck. The Black Widow. It was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and loathing. The collective paranoia of Havenwood Creek had found its vessel. Alara Vance, the silent woman in the cabin at the edge of the woods, was no longer just a mysterious outsider. She was a witch. The persecution of Alara Vance began not with violence, but with a creeping, suffocating hostility. When she came to the general store for flour and salt, the proprietor, Mr. Gable, served her with trembling hands, refusing to meet her eyes and practically throwing her change onto the counter. The other patrons would fall silent, turning their backs to her as if her very gaze could infect them. Children who once might have offered a curious wave now ran and hid when they saw her approaching. Whispers followed her like a shroud. She was accused of souring the milk, of blighting the remaining crops with a glance. A dead raven found on the path to her cabin was presented as undeniable proof of her communion with dark forces. They saw malice in her solitude, a sinister plot in her silence. Two of the town's more belligerent youths, emboldened by alcohol and the town's growing hysteria, took it upon themselves to act. They crept to her property line one night and painted a crude yellow hex symbol on a tree facing her cabin, a local folk magic sign meant to contain or repel evil. The next morning, Alara would have seen the symbol, a clear and unambiguous threat, a warning that she was being watched, judged, and condemned by the community. But her reaction, or lack thereof, was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. She did not confront anyone. She did not leave. She simply continued her quiet, isolated existence, as if the growing animosity of the town was nothing more than the rustling of autumn leaves. This stoicism was interpreted not as resilience, but as a sign of inhuman coldness, a confirmation of her guilt. She wasn't afraid of them, they reasoned, because she possessed a power far darker than their simple fears. What they failed to consider, in their blind panic, was that her stillness was not the stillness of power, but perhaps the stillness of resignation. The quiet calm of someone who had seen this all before and knew with a soul-crushing certainty how it was going to end. As October deepened and the trees shed their final, fiery leaves, the first human life was claimed by the creeping dread of Havenwood Creek. It was not a child, as the nightmares had suggested, but a man. Samuel Pike, a gruff and outspoken trapper who had been one of the loudest voices against the widow. He had publicly boasted in the town tavern that he wasn't afraid of any hearth witch, and that if his traps came up empty one more time, he would go down to her cabin and burn it to the ground himself. He was a man known for his robust health and boisterous nature. 3 days after his public threat, his wife found him dead in their bed. He was lying peacefully on his back, his eyes closed as if in slumber, but his skin was cold to the touch, and there was no breath in his lungs. His face was placid, almost serene, yet his wife let out a blood-curdling scream that brought neighbors running. The town doctor, a man already unnerved by the inexplicable animal deaths, was summoned once again. He performed a thorough examination of Samuel Pike's body. He found no wounds, no signs of poison, no indication of seizure or heart failure. It was, for all intents and purposes, as if the man had stopped. He had laid down to sleep and his body had forgotten how to wake up. It was a horrifying, medically impossible conclusion. As the doctor prepared to leave the somber cabin, Pike's grieving wife noticed something on the pillow nestled beside where her husband's head had lain. It was a single, perfect feather. It was jet black like the wing of a raven or a crow. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through the small crowd gathered outside. A black feather, a symbol of dark omens. It was a message, and everyone in Havenwood Creek knew exactly who had sent it. The curse was no longer a thing of nightmares and sick livestock. It had crossed a forbidden threshold. It was now a cold case, a murder without a weapon, and the town had its prime suspect. The death of Samuel Pike shattered the last vestiges of restraint in Havenwood Creek. Fear metastasized into a righteous, vengeful fury. That evening, a mob formed. It was not a wild, chaotic rabble, but something far more chilling. A quiet, determined procession of about 30 men, their faces hard and grim in the torchlight. They carried lanterns, axes, and hunting rifles. At their head marched Reverend Blackwood, his Bible held aloft like a weapon, and Jedediah Croft, the town founder, his face a mask of weary resolve. They were not going to ask questions. They were going to deliver a verdict. Their destination was the old Miller cabin at the edge of the woods, the home of the Black Widow, Elara Vance. As they approached, they saw a single light burning in her window, a soft, golden glow against the encroaching darkness. The mob surrounded the small cabin, their torches casting long, dancing shadows that made the trees themselves seem to writhe and recoil. Reverend Blackwood stepped onto the porch, his knuckles rapping hard against the wooden door. "Elara Vance," he boomed, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet. "In the name of God and the good people of Havenwood Creek, you are accused of witchcraft, of consorting with demonic forces, and of the murder of Samuel Pike. Open this door and face your judgment." The light in the window was extinguished. A profound silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackling of the torches and the heavy breathing of the men. For a long moment there was no response. The mob grew restless, their hands tightening on their weapons. They were a powder keg of fear and anger, and the fuse had been lit. Then with a slow, deliberate creak, the door swung inward. Elara Vance stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the darkness of her home. She was not crying or pleading. Her face, illuminated by the flickering torchlight, was eerily calm. And in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet carried with chilling clarity to every man present, she said, "You are making a terrible mistake." Her calmness was her undoing. To the terrified and enraged men of Havenwood Creek, her lack of fear was the ultimate confession. A righteous woman would weep, would protest her innocence, would call upon God for deliverance. Elara Vance did none of these things. She simply stood there, a specter of quiet sorrow, and watched them with eyes that seemed to see right through them, into the dark, frightened corners of their souls. This unnerved them more than any curse could. Jedediah Croft, trying to maintain a semblance of order, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice strained, "a man is dead. Our children are tormented. Our town is dying. We have reason to believe you are the cause." Elara's gaze shifted to him. "The cause," she repeated, her voice hollow. "You believe I am the cause of a sickness that was here long before I arrived. You are fools. This valley is poisoned, not by me but by a memory you have tried to bury." Reverend Blackwood pushed past Croft, his face purple with rage. "Blasphemy! You will not twist your evil with riddles, witch. You have brought a plague upon us." He pointed a trembling finger at her. "The black feather found on Pike's pillow, that is your demonic seal." For the first time a flicker of something, was it surprise, or perhaps bitter irony, crossed Alara's face. "A black feather," she murmured almost to herself. "So it has truly begun again." Her words, meant for no one, were seized upon by the mob. "A confession!" someone yelled from the back. The cry was taken up by others. The orderly procession devolved into a true mob. They surged forward, grabbing her. Alara did not struggle. She allowed them to bind her hands, her strange placidity continuing to unnerve her captors. As they dragged her away from her home, one of the younger men, driven by a morbid curiosity, broke away and entered her cabin. The others followed him in, holding their torches high. What they found inside would only deepen the horrifying mystery and seal the town's grim fate. The inside of Alara Vance's cabin was not the sinister lair of a witch they had expected. There were no cauldrons, no strange podio, no spellbooks bound in human skin. It was shockingly, disturbingly sparse. A simple cot, a small table with a single chair, and a cold, empty hearth. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, lavender and sage, but these were commonly used for preserving linens and warding off insects, not for dark magic. The walls were bare, save for one unsettling feature. Dozens of small, intricate charcoal drawings were pinned to the rough-hewn logs. They were not drawings of demons or devils. They were portraits, faces of men, women, and children, all rendered with a delicate, haunting precision. The men of the mob stared at the drawings, their torchlight dancing across the faces. A chilling realization dawned on them. They recognized these people. It was every single soul in Havenwood Creek. Every man, every woman, every child, their likeness captured in charcoal. Some smiled, some looked grim, some were asleep. It was as if she had been studying them, documenting them, one by one. But it was the other discovery that truly cemented their terror. In the corner of the room was the iron-bound chest she had arrived with. It was locked with a heavy, ornate padlock. Driven by a furious need for answers, two of the men took an axe to it, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the small cabin. When they finally broke it open, they recoiled in shock. The chest was filled to the brim with feathers. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. All of them were identical. All of them were jet black. The sight was inexplicable, macabre, and in the minds of the townsfolk, the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. This woman was not merely a witch. She was a monster, a collector of souls, and they had just uncovered her nest. The curse was real, and they had caught it. They locked Alara Vance in the small, stone-walled root cellar beneath the church. It was cold, damp, and windowless, a makeshift dungeon for the woman they had condemned. A trial was set for the following day, though its outcome was a foregone conclusion. Reverend Blackwood would preside, with Jedediah Croft and the town elders acting as jury. It was to be a trial of faith, not of law. That night, a profound and eerie quiet fell over Havenwood Creek. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the tense, watchful silence of a town under siege, a town that believed it had finally captured its boogeyman. Families locked their doors and shuttered their windows, holding their children close. The nightmares, they prayed, would finally cease. But the darkness in the valley was not imprisoned in the cellar beneath the church. It was far older, far more patient, and it had been waiting for just this moment. As midnight approached, a new phenomenon began. A low, rhythmic humming sound seemed to rise from the very earth itself. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind, but it slowly grew in volume and intensity. It was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabins and rattled the glass in the window panes. It was a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and settle deep within the chest, a disquieting, visceral sensation. Those still awake listened in growing alarm. It was the same bone-chilling hum that the children had described from their nightmares. Only now it was not in a dream, it was real. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once, a malevolent lullaby sung to the terrified town. It seemed to emanate from the woods, from the sky, from the ground beneath their feet. With the witch locked away, they thought they would be safe. But as the horrifying hum enveloped their homes, a new, far more terrifying thought began to dawn on them. What if they hadn't locked the evil in? What if they had locked themselves in with it? The trial of Ilara Vance was a grim, farcical affair. It took place in the church, the same space where just days before, Reverend Blackwood had stoked the flames of their paranoia. Ilara was brought from the cellar, her hands still bound. She looked pale and exhausted in the morning light, but her eyes held the same unnerving calm. The entire town was present, their faces a mixture of fear, hatred, and a desperate need for this nightmare to be over. One by one, townsfolk came forward to testify. Martha Croft spoke of the widow's cold demeanor. Mr. Gable from the general store described her unnatural eyes. Several parents recounted their children's horrifying nightmares. The black feather from Samuel Pike's deathbed was presented as evidence, as were the charcoal portraits and the chest of feathers found in her cabin. Through it all, Ilara remained silent. She did not offer a defense. She did not refute their claims. When Reverend Blackwood finally turned to her, his voice dripping with righteous condemnation, and demanded to know if she denied being a witch, her response was chilling. "I deny nothing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But I will ask you one question, Reverend. Before I arrived, did this town have a and why secrets? Any old sins left unatoned? Think carefully before you answer. Some debts are not owed to God." Her words were a cryptic, unsettling challenge. Blackwood, taken aback, flew into a rage. "Insolent creature, you will not poison this sacred place with your lies. You seek to blame the righteous for your own demonic pacts." He turned to the makeshift jury. "There can be no doubt. She is guilty. She has all but confessed. We must purge this evil from our community before it consumes us all." Jedediah Croft, looking deeply troubled, nodded in grim agreement. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at sunrise the next day. The townsfolk let out a collective sigh of relief. Justice would be done. The curse would be broken. They had no idea that they had just condemned themselves. As Ilara was led back to the cellar, Jedediah Croft, the town's founder, felt a deep and profound unease. The widow's question about old sins had struck a nerve, stirring a memory he had long kept buried. That night he found himself unable to sleep. The low, incessant humming that had started the night before was still present, a constant, subliminal pressure on the edge of hearing. Driven by a gnawing anxiety he couldn't explain, he unlocked his study and went to an old, dust-covered trunk. Inside, beneath faded maps and land deeds, was a leather-bound journal. It was his father's, the first founder of the settlement that would become Havenwood Creek, a man who had died decades ago. Jedediah had never read it in its entirety. His father had been a grim, taciturn man, and the journal was filled with his cramped, severe handwriting. He lit a candle and opened it to the first page, dated 1802. The early entries were mundane: notes on clearing the land, building the first cabins, enduring the harsh winters. But as he read deeper into the journal, the tone began to change. His father wrote of a shadow in the woods, a presence the local natives had warned them about. They called it the Whispering Mother, an ancient spirit of the valley that demanded a toll for the use of its land. The natives had their own rituals, offerings of blood and grain to keep it placated. Jedediah's father, a devout Christian, had dismissed it as pagan nonsense. He had driven the natives from the valley, claiming the land for God and his new community. But then a sickness had come, just as it had now. Livestock dying, crops failing, children plagued by nightmares of a humming woman in the shadows. A cold dread washed over Jedediah as he read the familiar, horrifying details. This had all happened before. The journal became more frantic, more terrifying with each turned page. Jedediah's father described a growing madness in the original settlement. People grew paranoid, turning on one another, seeing the shadow's mark on their neighbors. They performed exorcisms, held prayer vigils, but the entity only grew stronger, feeding on their fear. The final entries were nearly illegible, the handwriting a desperate scrawl. His father wrote of a pact, a terrible, forbidden bargain made in a moment of utter desperation. He went into the woods alone, to the ancient, moss-covered standing stones the natives had revered. He offered the entity something in exchange for his community's survival. "She does not want blood," his father wrote, his words stained with terror and regret. "She wants tribute, a keeper, one soul to stand as warden, to live on the edge of her domain and bear the weight of her sorrow. A life of solitude and silence to act as an anchor to keep her from wandering. In exchange, she will sleep." The deal was struck. A young woman from the settlement, an orphan with no family, was chosen. She was made to take a vow of silence and live apart from the others in a cabin built at the edge of the woods. She became the first keeper. As long as she lived, the community was safe. But the pact was a curse in itself. When the keeper died, or if the pact was ever broken, the Whispering Mother would awaken again, hungry and vengeful, to collect the debt in full. A debt that was now generations overdue. Jedediah Croft slammed the journal shut, his hands shaking. The Miller cabin, the one that had always been shunned, that had stood empty for years before Elara Vance arrived. It wasn't just an old cabin. It was the keeper's house. And the last one had died nearly a year ago. Elara Vance wasn't the witch. She wasn't the curse. She was the new keeper, come to honor a pact they had forgotten, and they were about to execute her. A cold, horrifying realization dawned on Jedediah Croft. Elara's cryptic words at the trial now made perfect, terrifying sense. "This valley is poisoned by a memory you have tried to bury." The charcoal portraits, she wasn't cursing them. She was trying to learn the faces of the people she was bound to protect. The chest of black feathers, perhaps not a witch's tool, but a macabre ritual compo. Meant for the keeper, a way to absorb or ward off the entity's influence. Her silence, her sorrow, her isolation. It was not malice, it was the required sacrifice of the pact. They hadn't caught a witch. They had captured the very person who was standing between them and a horrifying, ancient entity. By persecuting her, by accusing her, by breaking the sacred truce between the town and the Whispering Mother, they had invalidated the pact. They had told the entity in no uncertain terms that its warden was no longer welcome. They had released it. Jedediah's blood ran cold. The humming, the sickness, the nightmares, it wasn't Elara's magic. It was the Whispering Mother slowly waking from its slumber, its influence seeping back into the valley now that its anchor was gone. And the trial, the verdict, the impending execution, it was the final, unforgivable insult. They had taken the entity's tribute and sentenced it to death. The consequences would be unimaginable. He had to stop it. He grabbed the journal and ran from his house, coatless, into the pre-dawn chill. The hanging was set for sunrise. He didn't have much time. The humming in the air seemed to mock him, a low, triumphant thrum that promised a terrible reckoning. The entire town was asleep, dreaming their last peaceful dreams, convinced they were safe. Jedediah Croft ran through the silent streets, a man possessed by a truth more macabre and disturbing than any tale of witchcraft. He was running to save a woman he had condemned, to stop a horror he had helped unleash. If you find yourself captivated by this descent into the forbidden history of Havenwood Creek, and you want to ensure you don't miss a single chilling revelation, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. The story of what happens next has been all but erased from the official records. A chapter of American history so disturbing it exists only in whispers. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to unearthing these macabre, cold cases. The events of the next few hours in Havenwood Creek are the stuff of nightmares, and the full, horrifying truth of the curse is far more twisted than simple folklore. Jedediah Croft raced towards the church, the journal clutched in his hand like a holy relic. He burst through the doors of the building where Reverend Blackwood was sitting in the front pew, keeping a solitary, pious vigil. "Reverend, stop the execution," Jedediah gasped, out of breath. "We've made a terrible mistake, a horrifying mistake." Blackwood looked up, his expression one of stern disapproval. "Jedediah, what is the meaning of this outburst? Justice is about to be served. The Lord's will is being done." "No, it's not God's will, it's a curse of our own making." Jedediah thrust the open journal into the preacher's hands. "Read this, it's my father's journal, it explains everything. The sickness, the nightmares. Elara Vance is not the witch. She's the gatekeeper, the warden. We've broken a pact." Reverend Blackwood glanced down at the book, his lip curling in disdain at the frantic, yellowed pages. He read a few lines, his expression hardening. He saw the talk of spirits, of pacts with ancient entities, of pagan rituals. He saw not a confession, but the ramblings of a man who had lost his faith, who had succumbed to the very superstitions he himself fought against every Sunday. He snapped the journal shut and handed it back to Jedediah. "This is madness," he declared, his voice cold and absolute. "Your father was a troubled man, it seems. This is nothing but sacrilegious folklore. The devil's work is to create confusion, to make us doubt. The woman in the cellar is a witch and she will hang. That is final." Jedediah pleaded, he argued. He pointed to the uncanny parallels between the journal's account and their current plight. But Reverend Blackwood was immovable, his faith a fortress against any truth that did not fit his rigid worldview. To him, the journal was not evidence. It was heresy, a final, desperate trick by the condemned witch to save her own skin by poisoning the minds of the town's leaders. "The humming, Reverend, can't you hear it? It's the sound my father wrote about." "The sound of the entity awakening," Jedediah insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "It is the sound of the devil laughing at your weakness, Jedediah," Blackwood retorted, his eyes blazing with conviction. "You have let fear compromise your soul. Go home, pray for your own salvation. I will see to the towns." Defeated, Jedediah stumbled back out into the gray light of dawn. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge, painting the sky in pale, sickly shades of pink and orange. In the town square, a makeshift gallows had been erected. The townspeople were beginning to gather, their faces grim and expectant. They were there to witness the end of the curse. Jedediah saw the blacksmith, the store owner, the farmers, all the men he had led to Alara's cabin. He saw their wives clutching their children's hands. They looked at him and nodded, a shared sense of grim purpose passing between them. He was their leader, and he had led them down a path to utter damnation. He tried to speak to them, to warn them, but his words were lost in the crowd's determined murmur. They saw the journal in his hand and assumed it was further proof of the widow's guilt. They patted his back, telling him he had done the right thing, that he had saved them all. The horrible irony was crushing. As they led Alara Vance from the church cellar to the gallows, Jedediah Croft met her eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, only a profound, bottomless pity. And in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that she was not pitying herself. She was pitying them. Alara Vance was forced up the steps of the gallows. She did not resist. Reverend Blackwood stood before the silent crowd, his Bible held open. "Let this day be a testament," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square, "that this community will not suffer the presence of evil. We are God's people and we cast out the darkness." He placed the rope around Alara's neck. She did not flinch. She simply stared out, not at the crowd, but over their heads, towards the dark tree line of the western woods. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was a silent prayer, perhaps, or a final, whispered warning. Jedediah Croft watched, paralyzed by horror and helplessness. The journal felt like a lead weight in his hands, a record of a sin about to be repeated. He wanted to scream, to rush the gallows, but he was frozen in place, a lone voice of truth in a wilderness of righteous conviction. As the final preparations were made, the humming that had been a constant, low thrum in the background began to change. It grew louder, deeper, and a horrifying new quality entered the sound. It began to resolve into something that was disturbingly like a voice. A chorus of discordant, whispering voices, thousands of them, all murmuring at once. The sound washed over the town square, and the people shifted uncomfortably, looking around in confusion and alarm. At that exact moment, as the sun's first true ray of light struck the valley floor, Reverend Blackwood gave the signal. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor sprang open. And in that instant, two things happened simultaneously. Alara Vance fell, and every bird in the valley took flight at once, a massive, screaming cloud of black that blotted out the rising sun, plunging the town square into a sudden, unnatural twilight. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a single, deafening roar. The curse had not been broken. The debt collector had arrived. The moment Alara's body dropped, the world in Havenwood Creek tilted on its axis. The roar of whispers that erupted from the woods was a physical force, a wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the church. The crowd cried out in terror, staggering back from the gallows, their moment of righteous triumph turning instantly into one of primal fear. The sky, now dark with a churning vortex of birds, cast the scene in a horrifying, strobe-like effect as the panicked creatures swirled and dove. But that was only the beginning. A foul, cloying scent rolled out of the forest, the smell of damp earth, of rot, of something ancient and long dead being disturbed. And then they saw it. At the edge of the town, where the forest met the cleared land, the shadows began to move. Not the normal shifting shadows of morning, but the shadows themselves. They deepened, darkened, coalescing into shapes that were tall and unnaturally thin. They flowed like ink spilled on water, pouring from between the trees, their forms vaguely, horrifically humanoid but lacking any distinct features. They were silent, fluid abominations, and they began to glide towards the town. Panic erupted. The townsfolk screamed and scattered, their mob mentality dissolving into individual terror. They ran for their homes, for the church, for anywhere they could hide from the encroaching tide of living darkness. Reverend Blackwood stood frozen on the gallows, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, his Bible fallen from his hands. He stared at the approaching shadows, the foundation of his faith cracking and crumbling in the face of this impossible, unholy sight. Jedediah Croft, however, did not run. He stood beside the gallows, staring at the body of the woman they had murdered, the keeper they had forsaken. He knew what was coming. He had read it in his father's journal. This was not an attack. This was a reaping. The whispering mother had awakened, and she had come to collect her long-overdue debt. The shadows flowed into the streets of Havenwood Creek, silent and inexorable. They did not have faces or hands, but the townspeople could feel their attention, a cold, psychic pressure that rooted them to the spot. The figures glided past the fleeing, screaming people as if they weren't there. They were not interested in them. Not yet. Instead, the shadow creatures moved with a clear and terrifying purpose toward the children, the very children who had suffered the nightmares. Mrs. Miller watched in catatonic horror as one of the figures stopped before her 7-year-old daughter, Prudence. The girl wasn't screaming. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unfocused as if she were in a trance. The shadow figure simply paused before her, and a low, humming sound, the same sound from the nightmares, emanated from it. Prudence, without a word, turned away from her mother and began to walk calmly towards the woods, following the shadow. "Prudence, no!" Mrs. Miller shrieked, breaking from her paralysis and running towards her daughter. But as she tried to grab the girl's arm, her hand passed right through it, as if the child were made of smoke. She stumbled, falling to the dirt, and could only watch as her daughter walked away, hand in hand with a being of pure darkness. The same horrifying scene was repeated all across the town. Young Thomas Gable, the blacksmith's 2 sons, little Sarah. One by one, the children of Havenwood Creek stopped their crying, their faces went slack, and they obediently followed the silent, shadowy figures back towards the forest from which they had emerged. There was no struggle, no violence. It was a quiet, orderly, and utterly macabre procession. The parents could only watch, their screams turning to choked sobs of helpless despair as their children vanished into the dark, whispering woods, leaving them behind in a town that was now cursed beyond all redemption. The entity was not destroying the town's future. It was simply taking it back. As the last of the children disappeared into the tree line, a new and even more terrifying phase of the reaping began. The shadows that had led the children away dissolved back into the woods, but the oppressive atmosphere they left behind did not lift. The humming intensified, and the disembodied whispers now seemed to come from inside the heads of the remaining townsfolk. They were insidious, personal whispers, murmuring their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets, their most profound guilts. For Mr. Gable, the store owner, the whispers accused him of cheating his customers for years. For Martha Croft, they reminded her of a hidden affair from her youth. The whispers were a psychic poison, turning neighbor against neighbor, husband against wife. The collective guilt over the execution of Alara Vance became a raging inferno of paranoia. Men who had been part of the mob now looked at each other with suspicion and hatred. "It was you," one man screamed at another, his eyes wide with madness. You were the first to call her a witch. A brawl broke out, then another. The carefully constructed society of Havenwood Creek was cannibalizing itself, consumed by a frenzy of fear and self-loathing, all orchestrated by the invisible, malevolent presence that now held the valley in its grip. Reverend Blackwood, who had descended from the gallows in a daze, suddenly began to laugh, a high, unhinged cackle that chilled the blood of anyone who heard it. "Fools, all of you!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the crowd. "It wasn't me. It was her, the witch. Even in death her curse works its evil upon us." His mind had snapped, his rigid faith utterly shattered by the reality of a power that his God could not or would not stop. He began to claw at his own face, tearing at his skin as he babbled verses from the book of Revelation, his sanity unraveling thread by horrifying thread. Jedediah Croft watched the town he had helped build descend into madness, and he knew it was over. He was perhaps the only one left with a sliver of sanity, protected in a grim way by the horrible knowledge he possessed. He knew this wasn't the witch's curse. This was the valley's judgment. He retreated into his home, the screams and shouts of the townspeople fading behind him. He went back to his study, the source of his terrible revelation, and barricaded the door. He didn't know if it would do any good, but it was all he could do. He sat at his desk, his father's journal open before him, and he began to write. He picked up his own quill, dipped it in ink, and started a new journal, a final testament to the horrifying events that had transpired. He wrote with a feverish intensity, wanting to leave a record, a warning, for anyone who might one day find this place. He described the arrival of Alara Vance, the growing paranoia, the trial, and the execution. He confessed his own role in it, his weakness in the face of Reverend Blackwood's certainty, his failure to act until it was too late. He described the arrival of the shadow beings, the taking of the children, and the madness that had now fully consumed the adults. As he wrote, the sounds from outside began to change. The screaming and shouting subsided, replaced by an eerie, unnatural quiet. A quiet punctuated by the occasional sound of a door creaking open, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt road. He peered through a crack in his window shutters. What he saw was the final, most macabre act of the curse. The townspeople, one by one, were walking out of their homes. Their faces were as blank and entranced as the children's had been. They walked in a slow, shuffling procession, all heading in the same direction, toward the dark, waiting woods. They were not being led by shadows anymore. They were simply going, beckoned by a call that only they could hear. Jedediah documented it all, his hand flying across the page. He described seeing the blacksmith, a man of immense strength and will, walk out of his forge, leaving the hammer to fall from his hand, and join the silent exodus. He saw Martha, his own wife, emerge from their bedroom, her eyes vacant, and walk out the front door without a word of farewell. He called to her, but she gave no sign of hearing him. She simply joined the line of shuffling figures moving toward the forest's edge. This was the entity's final harvest. It had taken the innocent. Now it was taking the guilty. It was not killing them, it was not torturing them. It was simply claiming them, wiping the slate clean, erasing the town of Havenwood Creek from the world as if it had never been. The procession continued for what felt like hours, a steady stream of souls relinquishing their lives, their homes, their very selves to the ancient power that ruled the valley. Jedediah was the last one left. The town outside his window was now completely silent, completely empty. The sun was high in the sky, but its light seemed thin and weak, unable to penetrate the profound aura of wrongness that now saturated the air. He was alone, the only survivor. He wrote his final entry, his hand shaking so badly the words were nearly a scribble. "The debt is paid. My father's sin and now ours. She took them all. I am the only one left. I do not know why I have been spared. Perhaps to leave this warning. Do not come here. This land is forbidden. It belongs to her now. The humming has stopped, but I can hear a new sound. A woman weeping. It is coming from the walls." His pen scratched to a halt. He looked around his study at the familiar books and maps, now alien and meaningless artifacts of a dead world. The sound of weeping grew louder, closer. It was inside the room with him. He did not scream. There was no point. He simply closed the journal, placed it in the center of his desk, and waited. Months passed. Winter came and went, blanketing the silent town in a thick shroud of snow. Spring arrived and the wildflowers bloomed in the untended yards. The silence of Havenwood Creek remained unbroken, a horrifying anomaly in the heart of the Virginia wilderness. It was not until early summer of 1856 that a group of surveyors, charting a new path for a proposed railroad, stumbled upon the valley. They were immediately struck by the same eerie quiet that had greeted the merchant Silas Kane months earlier. What they found was a ghost town, perfectly preserved yet utterly devoid of life. They documented a scene of profound and disturbing stillness. In one cabin, a pot of stew, now a solid block of green mold, sat in a cold hearth. In another, a half-finished game of checkers was on a table, the pieces coated in a thick layer of dust. The church doors were wide open, hymn books still resting in the pews. In the town square the gallows still stood, a frayed rope swinging gently in the breeze. But there were no bodies, no bones, no graves. There was no evidence of what had happened to the 150 souls who had lived there. They had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The surveyors, deeply unnerved, made a cursory search of the buildings. Most were unremarkable, filled with the mundane possessions of people who expected to come home. But in the largest house in the town, the home of the founder Jedediah Croft, they found the journal. It was sitting on a desk in the study, open to the last, terrifying entry. The surveyors read it, their blood turning to ice. The story it told was one of madness, superstition, and a horror that defied all rational explanation. It was a tale of a curse, of a forgotten pact, and of a spectral entity called the Whispering Mother. The discovery of Jedediah Croft's journal created a problem for the authorities and the land company that had funded the survey. The story it contained was too fantastical, too horrifying to be believed, yet the evidence of the empty town was undeniable. To admit that an entire community had been wiped out by a supernatural entity, a curse, was unthinkable. It would cause a mass panic. It would halt westward expansion in the region. It would make the land worthless. So a cover story was fabricated. The official report, filed in the state capitol and circulated in newspapers, was brief and tragically simple. The town of Havenwood Creek, its star, Ted, had been the victim of a sudden and virulent outbreak of diphtheria or cholera. The isolated community, lacking proper medical care, had been completely wiped out. The few survivors, the report speculated, must have fled the area, carrying the sickness with them and likely perishing in the harsh wilderness. The bodies, it was claimed, had been buried in a mass grave by the first responders to prevent the spread of the disease, though the location of this grave was conveniently never specified. The story was clean, tragic, and medically plausible. It explained the empty town without inviting uncomfortable questions about spectral entities and shadow creatures. Jedediah Croft's journal was confiscated, classified, and buried deep within a state archive, labeled as the delusional writings of a grief-stricken man. The name Havenwood Creek was struck from maps. The valley was deemed unsafe for settlement due to the lingering plague, and was effectively declared a banned zone. The true, horrifying story of what happened was systematically erased, becoming a forbidden history, a cold case that was officially closed before it was ever truly opened. The world was told a lie, and the valley was left to its secrets, and to its silent, eternal keeper. But legends are not so easily erased. While the official story was one of disease, the men who first found the town, the surveyors, the initial investigators, they knew what they had seen. They had felt the oppressive wrongness of the valley. They had read the journal. They told their families, their friends, in hushed, frightened tones. The story of the widow's curse and the town that vanished became a piece of whispered folklore in the Appalachian region, a ghost story told around campfires. Over the decades, the details warped and changed. Some versions claimed the witch had summoned demons from the woods. Others said she transformed into a giant raven and carried the townspeople away one by one. But the core elements remained: a mysterious widow, a paranoid town, and a terrible, all-consuming curse. The valley itself became a place of profound dread. Locals called it Hush Hollow or Weeping Valley. They said that on quiet nights, If you stood on the ridges overlooking the empty town, you could still hear the faint, disembodied sound of a woman crying. Hunters refused to go near it. Animals seemed to instinctively avoid its borders. Several attempts were made over the next century to resettle or develop the land, but each one ended in failure and tragedy. A logging company in the 1890s abandoned their operation after their equipment repeatedly and inexplicably failed, and their workers were plagued by relentless nightmares, deserting the camp in the middle of the night. A planned reservoir project in the 1950s was scrapped after a series of strange, fatal accidents and the discovery of unsettling, ancient-looking symbols carved into the bedrock. The land itself seemed to actively resist human presence. It was as if the pact, so violently broken by the residents of Havenwood Creek, had been permanently rewritten. The valley no longer wanted a keeper. It simply wanted to be left alone. The fate of Alara Vance's cabin is a particularly macabre footnote in the legend. While the rest of the town was left to slowly decay, her small home at the edge of the woods seemed to defy the passage of time. Decades after the event, local explorers who dared to venture into the valley reported that while the other buildings were collapsing into ruin, the witch's cabin remained eerily intact. The wood did not seem to rot. The roof did not collapse. It stood as a silent, preserved monument to the tragedy. It was here that the most disturbing phenomena were reported. Visitors spoke of a palpable cold spot surrounding the cabin, even on the hottest summer days. They claimed to see a pale, sorrowful woman's face appear for a fleeting moment in the grimy windowpane. The charcoal portraits that had so terrified the mob were gone, but the walls were not bare. Newcomers who entered the cabin found that it was filled, once again, with hundreds of black feathers, seemingly appearing from nowhere, covering the floor like a soft, dark snow. But perhaps the most unsettling story concerns the iron-bound chest. After the town was discovered, the chest was found broken open and empty, its contents, the thousands of black feathers, presumably having blown away or been taken. Yet, according to local legend, the chest did not remain empty. Those who claimed to have entered the cabin in the years following the disappearance reported that the chest was sometimes closed and locked once more. On rare, terrifying occasions, they would find it slightly ajar, and from within they could hear a soft, rhythmic sound. The sound of a human heartbeat. It was as if the chest was no longer a simple container but had become a vessel, a reliquary for something that had been left behind. The physical heart of the curse, still beating in the ruins of the town it had claimed. The true nature of the Whispering Mother remains the central, horrifying mystery of the Havenwood Creek case. Jedediah Croft's journal provides the only real insight, but its description is that of a terrified man grappling with a concept far beyond his comprehension. He describes it as an ancient spirit of the land, an entity tied to the valley itself. This aligns with certain pre-colonial mythologies of the region, which speak of powerful, often female personified nature spirits that were both providers and destroyers. These entities were not evil in the Christian sense of the word. They were primal forces that operated on a different kind of morality, one of balance, respect, and reciprocity. The pact described in the journal, the offering of a keeper, is a classic folkloric motif. It is a bargain made between the mortal and the supernatural, a tribute paid to appease a powerful, territorial entity. The people of Havenwood Creek, under the guidance of Reverend Blackwood, broke this ancient contract. They viewed the land not as a living entity to be respected, but as a resource to be tamed and conquered. They mistook its agent, the keeper, for a malevolent witch. In their arrogance and fear, they committed the ultimate transgression. The horrifying events that followed were not an act of random, chaotic evil. They were an act of repossession. The Whispering Mother was not destroying the town. It was purging a contamination. It took the children first, perhaps seeing them as innocent and untainted, reclaiming them before they could be corrupted by the sins of their parents. Then, it drove the adults mad with their own guilt before dissolving their very existence, reabsorbing them back into the land they had disrespected. It was a horrifying, systematic erasure, a resetting of the balance. The entity wasn't a curse brought by a widow. The town's own intolerance was the curse that awakened the entity. The character of Alara Vance remains an enigma, a tragic and ghostly figure at the center of this macabre history. She was not a witch, but something far more complex and sorrowful. She was a keeper. But what did that truly mean? Was it a role passed down through a specific bloodline, a lineage of women tasked with containing this ancient power? Or was it a burden that fell to certain individuals who were sensitive to the supernatural, drawn to these haunted places? Her arrival in Havenwood Creek so soon after the previous keeper's death suggests a deep, perhaps psychic connection to the valley and its resident entity. She knew what was required. She understood the sacrifice of silence and isolation. Her calmness in the face of persecution was not inhumanity, but a weary acceptance of her fate. Perhaps she had seen other towns, other keepers, fall in the same way. Her final words to Jedediah, the look of pity she gave him, suggest she knew exactly what the town's actions would unleash. She wasn't just a warden. She was a Cassandra figure, a prophet of a doom that no one would believe until it was too late. Her charcoal portraits take on a new, poignant meaning in this light. They were not the collection of a predator, but the work of a shepherdess trying to learn her flock, the very people she was sworn to protect, even as they grew to hate her. And the chest of black feathers, was it a tool to appease the whispering mother or a way to absorb its dark influence, taking the valley's sorrow into herself? We will never know for sure. She is a ghost in the historical record, a woman defined only by the horrifying events she failed to prevent. She was the town's only hope, and they hanged her for it. If you've made it this far, the dark history of Havenwood Creek has clearly captured your imagination. These forgotten stories, these forbidden cold cases, are what we are dedicated to unearthing. To ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into the macabre, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The threads of this mystery run deeper than you can possibly imagine, and what we discuss next might change how you see the quiet, forgotten places on the map. The story of Havenwood Creek is often treated as an isolated, folkloric event. But what if it wasn't? In the decades following the town's disappearance, a disturbing pattern of similar, smaller-scale events was documented, though never connected, in other isolated Appalachian communities. A mining settlement in West Virginia in 1872, where a dozen children simply walked into the woods and were never seen again. A small farming community in eastern Kentucky in 1881 that was found completely empty, with no signs of struggle, after the residents had violently cast out a reclusive herbalist woman they accused of cursing their crops. In each case, there are fragments of the Havenwood Creek pattern. An insular community, a distrusted outsider, often a woman, a period of unexplained misfortune, and a final, inexplicable vanishing. Could it be that the Whispering Mother is not an entity confined to a single Virginia valley? What if it, or others like it, are a fundamental part of the ancient, brooding landscape of the Appalachian Mountains? What if the keepers were part of a loose, unrecognized network of individuals who understood the old rules, the old pacts required to live safely on that land? The execution of Alara Vance may not have just doomed one town. It may have broken a link in a chain, weakening a fragile peace across the entire region, and allowing the darkness that slumbers beneath the mountains to stir in its sleep. Havenwood Creek was not the end of the story. It was just the loudest scream in a long, terrifying silence. Let us return to the two primary artifacts of this case, the journals, the father's and the son's. Jedediah Croft's father's journal is a testament to a sin committed out of a desire for progress. He drove out the native people, ignoring their warnings and their wisdom, and in doing so, he disturbed a power he did not understand. His subsequent pact was an act of desperation, a bargain that mortgaged the future of his community for its immediate survival. It was a sin of pride and ignorance, and it planted the seed of the town's eventual destruction. The town of Havenwood Creek was built on a cursed foundation, a debt that was simply left for the next generation to pay. Then there is Jedediah's own journal. It is a confession, a horrifying first-hand account of the consequence of that inherited sin, compounded by a new one. The sin of his generation was not ignorance but fear, fear of the outsider, fear of the unknown. Fear that was expertly manipulated by Reverend Blackwood into a religious hysteria. They had a savior living among them, a woman performing a silent, lonely penance for their ancestors' transgression, and they saw her as a demon. Jedediah's journal is a record of a society consuming itself, a perfect storm of buried history and weaponized faith. His final chilling entry, the humming has stopped, but I can hear a new sound. A woman, weeping, is perhaps the most macabre detail of all. After the violent, roaring judgment of the reaping, after the silent, empty claiming of the souls, the entity's final expression was not anger or triumph. It was sorrow, a profound, eternal grief, perhaps for the keeper she had lost, or perhaps for the violent, fearful nature of the humans she had been forced to erase. The weeping is the true curse, the sound that haunts the valley to this day. The official explanation of disease, while effective in quelling public panic, falls apart under even the slightest scrutiny. Cholera or diphtheria, while deadly, do not cause an entire population to vanish without a trace. Such outbreaks leave behind a grim and obvious trail: bodies, hasty burials, records from neighboring towns of refugees seeking aid. Havenwood Creek had none of these. The scene was one of peaceful, instantaneous abandonment. The preservation of the site, with food on tables and tools in workshops, is completely inconsistent with the slow, agonizing decline of a community ravaged by plague. Furthermore, the complete lack of any human remains is the single most damning piece of evidence against the official story. Not a single bone, not a single tooth, not a single unmarked grave was ever found by the surveyors or subsequent explorers. It is physically impossible for 150 people, including the elderly and infants, to perish from a disease and leave absolutely no biological trace. The only way to accept the official story is to believe in a cover-up of staggering proportions, one that would have required a small army to sanitize the entire valley and secretly dispose of every body. It is far more difficult to believe in such a perfect, silent conspiracy than it is to confront the chilling alternative presented in Jedediah's journal. The story of the Whispering Mother, as horrifying and supernatural as it is the only explanation that fits all the disturbing, inexplicable facts of the case. The town of Havenwood Creek didn't die. It was deleted. It became a cold case not because the evidence was lacking, but because the evidence pointed to a truth that was simply too terrifying for the world to accept. What remains today of Havenwood Creek? Nothing. In the late 20th century, the land was finally acquired by the federal government and incorporated into a vast national forest. Its exact location was deliberately obscured, absorbed into the anonymity of thousands of square miles of protected wilderness. No roads lead there anymore. The trails have been overgrown for a century. The last vestiges of the town, the stone foundations, the collapsed timbers, the lonely gallows in the square, have been reclaimed by the forest, swallowed by the slow, inexorable digestion of nature. It has been wiped from the maps, and now it has been wiped from the land itself. All that is left is the story, a forbidden tale that persists like a stubborn ghost. It is a macabre cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, the arrogance of faith, and the price of forgotten history. It reminds us that the world is older and stranger than we often care to admit, and that there are some places, bound by ancient rules and guarded by ancient powers, where we simply do not belong. The mystery of the widow's curse is, in the end, unresolvable. We are left with Jedediah Croft's horrifying account in a century and a half of chilling silence. There are no definitive answers, only lingering, dreadful questions. Was the Whispering Mother a real, conscious entity or a psychic manifestation of the town's own guilt and fear? A folie à deux on a terrifying scale. Who was Alara Vance, really? And what happened to Jedediah Croft after he wrote his final entry, as the sound of weeping filled his study? Did she take him too? Or was he left there, a man cursed to live, to be the sole witness and rememberer of the horror, a fate perhaps worse than vanishing with the rest. The ultimate horror of Havenwood Creek is not in the violent spectacle of its demise, but in the profound, absolute nature of its erasure. It is a story about a town that touched a forbidden truth and was, in return, utterly and completely unmade. They were not just killed. They were removed from existence, their lives, their homes, their very memory becoming the property of the ancient, sorrowful thing that dwelt in the woods. The silence that fell upon that valley in 1855 was not the absence of sound. It was an active, malevolent presence. It was the sound of a slate being wiped clean. Today, the valley is just another anonymous patch of green on a satellite map, beautiful and deceptively peaceful. But the legend persists, a testament to the idea that some places are soaked in a history that cannot be washed away. And if you were to somehow find your way there to stand in the clearing where the town once stood, you might not see any ruins. You might not see any ghosts, but you might feel it. A profound coldness, a sense of being watched by the ancient trees. And if you listen very, very carefully past the sound of the wind, you might just hear it. The faint, distant, and eternal sound of a woman weeping for all that was lost, and for the terrible debt that was finally, horrifyingly, paid in full.